Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development and Consulting, the show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey. Before we move into today's lesson, let's make sure that we're on the same page. We've seen firsthand how much more is required to provide authentic leadership to a team than simply manage based on the authority that comes with a title or a position. What we've learned through more than 50 combined years of leadership responsibility is that taking the extra steps to serve people and to earn influence will always produce results that barking orders never will. If you'll stick with us through the end of this episode, we're going to share how you can get a complimentary trial to a resource we've built that's like nothing else you've ever seen. Now, with that in mind, let's get to work. This episode wraps up our look that we've had over the last few episodes at developing and really avoiding the costs of constantly recruiting by developing a strong recruiting pipeline in our organizations. Any way we slice it, recruiting great people, the best ones that we can get for our organization, recruiting them to join our teams, it comes with a price tag. That's just part of what it is, right? When we're forced to recruit constantly because the business is growing, it's hard enough, especially in a world where those great people are hard to come by. But if our voluntary turnover, the profitability killer we looked at most recently, is an issue and it's something that we've got to deal with, we've not provided with our best people with a solid reason to say, we can expect those recruiting costs to turn into real and substantial profitability killers. And while that leadership involvement can have a significant impact on that recruiting process, let's be honest, there's never a shortage of demands on a leader's time. So it's critical that we're extremely intentional about being involved where it can really help the most. Now, just recently, I'm having a conversation with a friend of mine. We're actually in the gym. He does some high-end video production work for a national healthcare system, and he asked for my feedback on what he was asked to do in streamlining one of his client organization's orientation process was. And he told me that at that point in time, each member of that executive team, it's a large healthcare system, they had a direct role with all new employees that came into the organization, and they had approached him about potentially creating some type of video orientation that would replace what they were doing so they could free up some of that time, because it really was a time commitment. He explained that this would also help them really drive consistency in the message, and it would provide coverage anytime any of those executives weren't available for that orientation with the new employees. Now, my feedback was immediately, hey, I think that would certainly be possible. And both of those things, it would free up time, it would ensure consistency in the message. However, I went on to share what I just shared with you about the comparison of those two different management teams. And more importantly, I shared with him the feeling that I've still got today, all these years later, about the different levels of involvement of those two different management teams. Now, here's the thing. Just showing up and rambling through a canned speech, that's not the secret sauce to a leader, a manager, a company owner being impactful in the recruiting process. Quite frankly, the managers who never participated in those weekly orientation sessions that I held from March of 2013 until I moved on from the organization in October 14, they probably improved retention by not interacting with those team members right away. The impact the plant manager made on me in 1996 wasn't because he popped in and talked to us. It was abundantly clear that he meant what he said, and he backed his words up with action as long as I knew him. And even after he retired, I had a better relationship, probably more consistent relationship with him even years after his retirement than some of the other managers I saw that followed him and how they interacted with folks. Now, in that conversation, I emphasized to my friend that how and when executives that he was working with, those executives, how and when they interacted with their new team members was far less important than it was for them to be completely genuine in every interaction they had with their teams. And gosh, that doesn't just happen. We've got to work on that. They would need to be very proactive in how they made sure they shared that message and it was genuine in doing it. Now, while doing that seems to be far too rare in organizations today, I'm 100% convinced that it's not difficult. I also don't believe that the majority of executives or even business owners who aren't currently involved in the recruiting process are doing so because they've got ill will toward their teams. I think it's usually a matter of them being pulled in all these different directions and initiating the involvement in the recruitment or the process or engagement with folks at all levels isn't necessarily the fire that they see as demanding their attention right then and there most of the time, right? It's other urgencies that are pulling them away. Now, regardless of what does pull them away from engaging their team, developing a strong recruiting pipeline, I don't believe it's very likely to happen unless they do that, unless they have that interaction that really raises the bar and says, here's why you want to be part of this culture. Now, I found an article that spoke to what was called the negative impact of a high turnover rate, and it detailed some undesired and often unrecognized challenges that come from that constant recruiting that high turnover can force. So that article shared, when you constantly have to recruit new employees, there's an increased risk of making poor hiring decisions. When there is a constant outflow of employees, you may be tempted to hire someone quickly without taking the time to properly vet them and assess whether they're a good fit for the company. The article went on to say how much this can spill over into the overall customer experience. Ultimately, it can impact companies' reputations with those customers. And I'm going to say, if as leaders, we have the awareness of how this can impact our customers and really kill profitability there too, being proactive about how we engage our teams might just be that fire that really demands the most of our attention, right? If we understand how it's hitting our bottom line. And I believe that goes a long way to earning the kind of candidate referrals. When we've got that interaction, we've got that engagement that can keep our recruiting pipeline full as we move forward at any given time. Now, none of this happens immediately. And I'm convinced that once we get that pipeline going, we should absolutely not ever shut it off once we have it flowing. But gosh, when we do get it going, it's going to happen and it's going to produce results. And to make sure that we've got that steady flow of potential candidates for every part of our organization, both now and into the future, we need to use the time where we're engaged with our team members to keep that vision in front of them and to make sure that they've got a clear picture of how they fit into that vision. So again, even when we're very, very proactive in our leadership roles about being engaged with our teams, there's more that we can do to develop that strong recruiting pipeline. Being directly involved in the recruiting process, that certainly helps, as does having those consistent presence with our teams. But I've never been able I've never been an advocate of getting in a bidding war to reel in candidates. Please understand that, because I believe it's inevitable that if we throw more money at somebody, sooner or later another organization is going to throw even more money and it's going to reel them away, and it's just not where we want to be. So if making endless counter offers isn't something that we want to get into, how can we really make sure we're attracting the best candidates if it's not going to be all about money? So in all those years that I worked in manufacturing, again, I'll say that company at that point in time offered one of the best starting pay ranges and some of the best benefits in our area. And none of the ones that offered higher, when I was doing wage surveys, none of the ones that offered higher entry-level wages at that point in time were hiring straight off the street. The few that did pay more typically offered temporary positions to start with a shot, excuse me, a shot at a full-time role later on. Now, while the lack of leadership engagement did indeed impact our recruiting process over those last couple of years, just the dollar signs alone, I could still attract a lot of attention from the younger crowd or folks that were looking to get a kickstart in their career and whatnot, because they just needed those finances, the overtime, the high dollar entry level wage, and so on and so forth. Now, when I left that large manufacturing facility and I started recruiting for some smaller locally owned businesses, many of those entry-level roles were geared at that same candidate pool, but offered several dollars less on the hour to start. Now, those roles with the smaller companies, they could potentially pay substantially more in just a few years once that individual developed the experience in that specific trade. Now, if I would have only geared my approach at trying to compete with the factory positions on starting pay alone, I'd have been left holding an empty sack on the recruiting side. It just wasn't going to work if I'm trying to compare pay when it was several dollars difference in the range. What I was able to do quite effectively, I had, was paint a clear picture for the options that a solid candidate had for growing moving forward, as well as the tools that we had in place in those organizations to help them take advantage of the options we could offer them. Okay. Now, if a candidate was just fishing for the most pay that they could make each week right away, right off the bat, that approach typically wasn't going to be what reeled them in, and that's okay. But if the primary thing they were looking for was money, let's be honest, it wouldn't have been long until somebody else flashed something shinier in front of them and pulled them away anyway. So by painting a solid picture, I found, for what they could really achieve over time and outlining here's specific career pathways and potential succession plans within the organization, I'm going to say I was able to bring in some really great people into each of the companies that I was supporting during those years. Now, my role for each of those organizations was to help attract great folks who had potential to become excellent team members. Casting a vision for their futures, part of that organization played a key role in developing, and I would argue capitalizing on a strong recruiting pipeline. Now, that said, we all know talk's cheap. Without actions back in the message that I was sharing, casting a vision would have only worked for a very, very short time. So we need to tie all this together with one critical step that's got to be in place for anything we've looked at to this point to really address that profitability killer and that we've been talking about here and yield long-term results. So if we want to have any real hope of capturing that profit that's so often killed, frequently killed in the recruiting process, and we want to build a strong pipeline, we've definitely got to be intentional about that involvement from leadership at all levels of the organization so we can cast a clear vision of where candidate can see themselves in the future. But we better be prepared to back any of our talk with action. Now, far too often, I've seen organizations tout these catchy phrases or throw around the latest buzzwords in the recruiting process, but never make good on any of it once that person accepts the position. Many times, all those promises come from the best of intentions, but the urgency and in the commitments take precedence. They get pulled away because there's so much right now, day-to-day urgency that gosh, we miss the mark, right? Occasionally, though, the time spent telling that candidate how much is going to be invested in their growth and development is really more than the time that company's ever going to allow from that point moving forward. And unfortunately, sometimes the person making those promises knows full well that they're not going to live up to it. Either way, whether it's intentional, whether it's not, the actions that follow will absolutely tell the real story. The proof is going to be in the pudding, right? Now, in an article I found on recruiter.com, it was called "Where Do You See Me in 5 Years? Job Seekers Are Turning the Tables on Professional Development." It shared this. It emphasized that developing our team members is absolutely a necessity. And it went on to say this: increasingly, candidates are weighing professional development in the same way they would benefits like health insurance and 401ks. A Gallup study found that today's job seekers care deeply about development opportunities when looking for jobs. And 87% of millennials say career growth is an important factor in the job search. And I would add that millennials are now the biggest part of our workforce. That article went on to say employers need to provide these opportunities in a real, actionable way. They can't just pay lip service to the idea. As the economy recovers post-pandemic, employers can look to professional development as a way to differentiate their companies and improve recruitment efforts. Another article that I found from the Society for Human Resource Management, it was called "Employees Want Additional Opportunities for Career Skills Development," quoted a fellow named Joe Dusing, Senior Director of Learning and Development for Paylocity, who I've interacted with some, as saying it this way: you shouldn't be doing anything about the Great Resignation, that thing we hear so much about. You should be doing something about employee experience. Every potential employee wants to know two things: what are the skills I need, and what are the programs that you have in place to support me? If you don't have, Joe says this to employers, if you don't have answers, they likely won't want to work for your company. Now, when we cast a vision for the potential a candidate has to grow within our organization, We certainly can attract some great people, but we better be prepared to provide them with the tools that they're going to need to move into bigger and better roles, or all that time that we've put into bringing them on the team is soon going to be repeated to bring somebody else on the team. And sooner or later, usually sooner, the reputation that we've earned for providing or even not providing those developmental opportunities is going to play a key role in our overall recruiting process. Now, make no mistake here. I'm absolutely not suggesting that we throw money blindly at any kind of training we hear about, we see, whatever. We need to be just as intentional about that as we would with any other investment we make with our business capital. And we've got to expect that that investment produces a measurable return. And I'll touch on that in just a second. Otherwise, the training could turn into just as big a profitability killer as the ongoing recruiting process that we've looked at here. We'll look at that return on investment, those expectations soon. For now, what I want to wrap up with is really challenge you to consider how you can implement something that we've covered here to capture the profit that so many companies lose in that recruiting process.
Thanks for listening to the Leading at the Next Level podcast. If you'd like to go deeper into anything that we've shared here, or you need those continuing education credits for your professional credential, send us an email at admin@dove-development.net, and we'll be happy to hook you up with a 45-day all-access trial to our complete Leading at the Next Level program at no cost. That full program, it includes access to well over 100 hours of digital lessons, complete with slides and action-based assessments to help you capture measurable bottom line improvements in your organization. It also has 2 live lessons each month that you'll get access to that always close with Q&A, so we can help you identify the specific action you want to take to lead your team more effectively.